So I love our last conversation, but still, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
So thank you, Eric, for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you again. I'm a Portuguese physiotherapist with postgrad, so post education especially in performance training. I've been working mainly with professional athletes from multiple sports regarding their mainly S&C training. So I've been working in sports such as volleyball, football, roller hockey, and mainly athletics as well in terms of individual sports. And currently, I'm one of the owners of a couple of training facilities here in Portugal called the Peak.
Cool, man. So last time we talked about not all strength creates equal and how you see like plyometric. Today I kind of want to talk about the post on your Instagram. It's also about like velocity based training. So first thing first, why do you think that we should use
Eric,
like
I think your connection is not working totally fine. At
oh
least I think it's on your side.
let me check.
I'm not able to listen to you properly.
Okay.
Yeah, the connection is really bad today.
Is it better now? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes,
Is it
I
clear?
think it's better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. Now it's better.
Sorry, man. So, uh,
No worries.
so let's this time I kind of want to talk about like velocity based training, which is also an interesting topic you post on your Instagram. So, first thing first, why do you think that athletes should uh use velocity based training?
Okay. So first of all, I think it's important to set a disclaimer. I would say that velocity-based training, it's the commonly known name for measuring bar velocity. However, I don't think it is a training method. It is simply a way of collecting and monitoring like strength qualities or capacities in the weight room without using, for example, traditional maximal tests such as 1RM. So measuring bar velocity in the weight room adds more objectivity in our analysis, in our decisions, but I don't think it is a training method. So normally people uh, associate VBT or velocity based training as training with high velocities or doing some sort of special training, but in fact, we can use bar velocity or we can collect bar velocity in everything we do in the weight room. So I would say it's not a training method. It is simply a way of monitoring. And I believe it is important. It can help a lot practitioners when working with athletes, especially to avoid traditional maximal tests that in the real world, in high competitive level, are very difficult to perform those tests because you don't have much time to train, not to recover from training and competition. So you are able to track your development or your progression without maximal testing. So basically, you are testing while training, and I would say that's one of the important things of tracking bar velocity in weight room.
So, uh, do you think that we should all like as a performance coach or as a strength and conditioning coach when it comes to like training athlete, do you think that we should all have that like that tech not like that technology stuff, no matter if it's like push band or like Max Pro or like uh I kind of forgot the name of the other the other
Yeah, there are plenty of devices,
yeah.
GymAware, Groove, so there are plenty of devices. I don't think it is mandatory for someone to have those that kind of technology. If you have the chance to have it, it can be a plus. It can help you. But if you don't have that kind of technology, I don't think you are not able to develop an athlete because although an important thing is that normally people think that velocity based training or measuring bar velocity is a new thing. It's a thing with like over the last decade, but in fact, bar velocities are being collected for plenty of decades already. So we can find records of people using this like 30, 40 years ago. Of course, the main difference today is that you have more accessible devices. Technology is more user friendly. Not only the hardware, but also the software is more developed today, but it's not a new thing. Uh, I think, apart from what I said previously regarding monitoring bar velocity, and in that case, you can track your progress. Another very important thing that tracking bar velocity or providing real-time feedback to the athlete is that given that you are providing a feedback to the athlete, is going to maximize his intent. So every time he's performing a lift, whether it's like a strength lift, like associated with the power lifts, or even if it's a ballistic lift, uh, if you provide real time feedback to the athlete, it can improve intent. And we know that maximal intent is very important, especially to maximize neural adaptations from from strength training. So I would say that more than simply tracking progress in training, I think the number one reason why tracking bar velocity can be a very good tool for any coach or athlete is that it stimulates you to perform with maximal intent, and probably that's why we see improvements in athletes using that kind of monitoring tool.
So if I don't have like that kind of device, as long as my athlete have like do the best whenever they do this training, it's all good, right?
It's all good, but it's always very difficult to guarantee maximal intent without feedback.
Yeah,
It's
true.
very difficult, and we see the same, for example, when performing isometric training. Let's
Yeah.
say if you use a overcoming isometric, if you are doing it with for example force platforms versus not using force platforms, the peak forces or the rate of force development that you can achieve with feedback is significantly different than when you don't have that feedback. So it definitely adds. It's a plus. It's a good thing to have. But of course, if you don't have it, it doesn't mean that your athletes don't improve, because a lot of people have been performing strength training in weight room and they improve without measuring bar velocities. It's just a tool in the box that can help any coach and athlete.
Cool. So on the part two of your post of velocity based training, you mentioned about like load velocity profile or like velocity relationships. I'm sorry. So can you like tell us about like what exactly is like load velocity profiling and the relationship between load and velocity.
Okay. So basically, when you use exercises or lifts that are associated with you trying to improve, for example, maximal strength, concentric maximal strength. So the maximal force you can produce irrespective of time. So normally it's associated with the power lifts, the back squat, the deadlift, bench press, chin ups, and so on. Uh, we know that there exists one of the muscle relationships is the force velocity relationship, and normally, and this was discovered and suggested like 1 century ago, and the research behind it, it was performed initially, I think I'm not wrong, in individual muscle fibers of frogs. So basically, they discovered that uh, when individual muscle fibers shorten at high velocities, you cannot produce a lot of tension or force, and vice versa. When short muscle fiber shortening is slow, you can produce higher amounts of tension or force. And people and coaches have been using this force velocity relationship and applying it to training or training exercises. However, people, and although this may be just semantics, I think it's very important to differentiate. So people have been calling, let's say, maximal strength exercises such as heavy squats, deadlifts, bench press, etc. They have been calling it high force, low velocity exercise, while sprinting and jumping and throwing, etc. They have been calling it low force, high velocity exercises. However, this is conceptually wrong because the force velocity relationship was related to individual muscle fibers. And when we account for all body movements, and so like complex movements, this force velocity relationship is more linear, and we shouldn't call it force velocity relationship. Otherwise, it makes us think that a sprint is a low force movement, high velocity. And this is, in fact, not true. We know that elite sprinters, while they are sprinting at every time they contact the ground, they have around 80 to 90 milliseconds and they experience peak forces of about 5 times body weight. So it's much higher than a 1 RM squat in the weight room. So this relationship should be called load velocity relationship. So it's more external load in comparison with velocity of movement. So when we use this kind of exercises in the weight room, what we can find is that every time we increase external load, there is a inverse relationship, linear inverse relationship with movement velocity. So if you do squats with 100 kilos, you will be able to move that load during a squat at a certain average velocity. If you make it 150 kilos, the velocity will drop. And given this inverse linear relationship between load and velocity, we can establish a profile for each athlete and for each individual exercise. So you can create a linear regression so that you can know around, like across the line of the linear regression, you can know with pretty good reliability, you can know for a certain load that will be a certain velocity. And this is very helpful because it allows you to estimate, for example, 1 RM for a certain exercise without performing 1 RM. We should have in consideration that the further away we are using loads from 1 RM, the more error the estimate will have. So basically, in order to perform a load velocity profile, you should have, let's say, 4 to 6 different external loads, progressive loads. So for example, if you are testing a back squat for an athlete who has an estimate of 150 kilos, 1 RM, you should probably start at around, let's say, 50% of that estimated 1 RM, let's say 75 kilos, and you check the correspondent velocity for that lift, the best velocity, after you increase, let's say, for 100 kilos, 120 kilos, 140 kilos. And by having a couple of loads, you are able to estimate 1 RM and to know for any load what kind of velocity would you be expecting for that exercise. But there are two very important facts in this, two very important considerations. The first one is athletes need to perform the concentric phase with maximal intent. That's number one. Number two is the range of movement. So you need to guarantee that the range of motion will remain the same for every repetition. Otherwise, if you change the range of motion, velocities will be different. So you'll be measuring different things with different repetitions. So you will see that the linear regression will not have such a high correlation. So these are the main two important factors to guarantee when you do this kind of profile for the main lift. So I'm talking about squats, deadlifts, bench press, chin-ups. These are the main exercises where people can perform these low velocity profiles.
I love the way you like explain like how like sprinting or like moving in the court is different with load velocity profiling. So since the force velocity relationship on when we do like maximal intense sprinting or like jumping is different with the thing we do or like load velocity with the weight room, how exactly should we program the training with these two?
Can you be a little bit more specific so that I
Like,
can?
let's say like if we're training a volleyball team and
Mhm.
they're probably gonna do like maximal intent jump like when they are in practice. Not I know that's not gonna be like every repetition is not gonna be like maximal intent, but how would you program the training since there's a lot of like flyo, a lot of like maximal intent, like sprinting movement, that kind of stuff, and how do you combine it with weight room training?
Okay, perfect. That's a very good question, and we experience that in every sport, right? Like every time you are practicing, you are not only practicing your sport, but you are exposed to to some movements that will also have a physical adaptation side. So it's not only technical or it's not only technical or tactical, it's also physical. So every time you are practicing your sport, you will have physical adaptations. And in the case of sports such as volleyball and basketball, and for example, if you go to more individual sports such as the high jump, like every time you are performing plyometrics in your sport, and the same for sprinting, right? Sprinting is plyometric in nature. Uh, so the philosophy should be that the weight room is just a complement to the sport. So if you try to get redundant in the weight room with what you are doing in practice, probably you are wasting a little bit your time and touching in the weight room the same things you are touching in your sport. Having the experience in volleyball, like there are, and of course it depends on coaching philosophy, but normally athletes in practice they experience hundreds of jumps hundreds of takeoffs in volleyball practice. So that's the question, like how many plyometric training or how many ballistic work should you be doing in the weight room. And the thing is, you need to have for sure in consideration with what they do in their sport. And in basketball and in volleyball, although they do very high volume of jumping, and that will be the most part of that jumping training, normally they have more time to produce force, and it's not very often that they will perform with maximal intent those drills. So I think there are two approaches that we can do in physical preparation. Number one is to do more extensive work, extensive plyometric work. So if you do low intensity plyometrics, although they are not so specific for a sporting action, such as sprinting, jumping, changing of direction, you can still get benefit from it in terms of stretch shortening cycle utilization with low cost. So it will not require a lot of recovery after that kind of stimulus, but you are still getting good adaptations. It's like I normally like to see extensive plyometrics as the, for example, the zone two, the low intensity running in endurance sports, for example, or the low intensity cycling. Like endurance athletes, normally, if they follow a polarized approach, around 80% of the training volume will be low intensity at paces or at speeds or at intensities that are far away from what they do in the competition. But why do they do that? Because in those intensities, they can accumulate volume, which will be very important to get adaptations. But since it's low intensity, they can recover fast. It's the same thing for sprinting. Sprinters are not sprinting every single day at like very high velocities. They can only do maybe that 2-3 times a week. And the other days, they do other kinds of running or drills that are more lower intensity. They can recover faster, but they are still getting, for example, skill improvement. They are still getting benefit from those lower intensity exercise. So I think for jumping is exactly the same thing. So if they are jumping a lot and jumping with intensity in their sport, you can use lower intensity versions of jumping so that you can get some adaptations, not only physiological, in this case, the stress shortening cycle, but also technical and rhythmical. When you do things with lower speeds and lower intensities, you can improve the skill and technical. You can be more focused in certain details that when you are performing with higher intensities or when you are performing your sport, you are not so focused or paying attention to it. So extensive plyometrics will be an option. The other option will be to add in around the sport practice, to add some high intensity plyometrics, but mainly in those sports with very short ground contact times. Because when you are doing, for example, when you are doing penultimate and takeoff steps in volleyball, so it's a bilateral takeoff in volleyball, it takes time. So athletes are spending maybe around 250, 350, 400 milliseconds during that time. So they are not so exposed to the fast stress shortening cycle. So you can use that in training, not only as a performance enhancement tool, but also injury risk reduction. For example, we know that in volleyball, ankle sprains are common, is a common injury. And we know that the injury mechanism happens in very short time frames. So there is research that tells you that injury mechanism for an ankle sprain lasts around 50 to 60 milliseconds. So if you are able to produce force faster, if you learn to have pre-activation of the lower limbs, especially the feet, and you can do that with short ground contact time plyometrics, that can be pretty helpful for those athletes. But of course, you cannot do it with large volumes because they are already jumping a lot in their sport. So I would say it's a little bit of dichotomy. So you can use both extensive work, you can use intensive work, but the number one thing, more important than the content itself, is the dosage and when are you going to apply those stimulus. So the time in relation to the sport practice, in relation to the next competition or the next match, is very important so that you don't overload too much the athlete.
Cool, love it. So next thing I want to ask is about, since we brought up like jumping in basketball and volleyball, those athletes they want to like jump higher and higher and higher. So as a performance coach, how exactly do we help our athlete to like let them jump higher?
Yeah, basically to jump higher, if we go to Newton's laws, Newton's told us this like some centuries ago. You know, like he already discovered what do you need to jump higher. It's basically you need to produce more force in relation to your body mass, and of course there are two things involved in that, and that's the definition of impulse. It's like you can change the force and the time. So you cannot change body mass of the athlete. Yeah, you can, and that's why body composition is so important for athletes. So you need to optimize body composition. But let's say the body mass will be fixed over time. It will not change too much. So you have two factors that you can manipulate. You can manipulate the amount of force you produce, and you can manipulate the time you have available to produce that force. And so you need to be able to produce higher forces in a certain amount of time related to your body mass. So that's the secret to jump higher. And of course, it looks pretty simple, but it's pretty hard to do. And it's very dependent on individual characteristics. So you'll have athletes that are more reactive, so they can produce more force in very short times. Those athletes are more elastic and reflexive in nature. I'm sorry for my dog. My dog is happy with my ass. Sorry for that.
No
So
worries, man.
you have more elastic and you have more elastic athletes that can produce more force in short time, and they depend more on elastic energy, more elastic energy stored mainly in connective tissue, mainly tendon. And those athletes, for example, in sports such as basketball, they have a natural tendency to do a single leg takeoff. They will choose for that, while you have other athletes that are more contractile in nature. They depend more on force production from contractile structures such as the muscles, and they need a little bit more time to produce that force. So the 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 manipulation you need to do, for example, in technique, will be dependent on what kind of athlete are you working with. Because if you are working with an athlete that needs more time to produce force, they will have the tendency to lower more in the penultimate step, so that when they reach the takeoff, they can spend a little bit longer in the ground. While for more reactive athletes, they normally don't lower so much because they don't need so much time to produce the vertical impulse to jump higher. So that's the number one thing. The technique can be adjusted regarding the natural or the strengths and weaknesses of the athlete. So more than trying to apply the same concept to every single athlete, the number one thing should be try to profile your athletes, see where they will what kind of strengths do they have and weaknesses, and try to adjust the technique according to their strengths. After that, you need to improve relative force to their body mass. So you can use the weight room for that. So you can use the weight room to improve the amount of impulse they can produce in a certain time. And for that, you can use concentric training, concentric developmental methods to improve concentric strength. So that will be useful for the propulsive phase of takeoff. But you need also to improve, let's say, the coupling phase of the stress shortening cycle. So every time you put the foot on the ground, there will be some yielding. There will be amortization phase, an eccentric phase, an amortization, a transition phase to the propulsion. So you need to also incorporate this kind of development in your training through eccentric training, not only slow and heavy eccentric training, but also very fast eccentric training. You can do that through isometrics and quasi isometrics. So those are some of the tools that we can use to try to improve the impulse the athlete can generate, especially the vertical impulse, since we are talking about vertical jumping, the vertical impulse that the athlete can produce when they are taking off for a jump.
So, uh, do like because like if we want to like train our athlete to like jump higher, then they need to like produce more force at probably at a lower time. Does that like increase the rate of the athlete getting injured or not?
Well, I think injury and performance are always are always the same side of the coin. So if you have athletes that are improving their performance, but they are getting injured all the time, the question is, are you really improving their performance? Because in order to perform, they need to be able to compete and to train in first place. But of course, every time you push the envelope, every time you are training, are increasing injury risk. And we know from some research, for example, every time you work towards, and today everyone talks about tendon stiffness, we know that every time you increase tendon stiffness without increasing the muscle capability, you will increase muscle injury risk. And if you are just training to improve contractile adaptations, probably you will not get as stiff. So that will harm your performance and can improve as well your injury risk. So I think the main thing is don't try to do just, and that's why the weight room and the traditional strength training can also be important, because it can reduce your injury risk. So when we talk about strength training, it's not only to improve performance, but also to reduce injury risk. But if we talk about performance, some things that are traditionally done in weight room may not improve performance. And we start this conversation by talking about velocity-based training. And a good example is that when using devices to monitor bar velocity, people normally only look at peak velocities or peak power, and they assume that if you improve power, it will improve performance. And it's not always the case, because normally people improve their power, but they are spending more time to produce that force. And when you go to your sport, you will not have so much time. And coaches such as Rolf Foreman and Randy Huntington have been talking for plenty of years about metrics such as the time to peak velocity, and plenty of times when we get higher power values and people are happy about it. But if you go to time to peak velocity or time to peak force, you will see that it's generations away from what happens in the sport. I'm not saying that the weight room is to try to replicate 100% what happens in the sport, because that's not possible. And if you want to replicate what happens in the sport, you need to be practicing your sport. But I think especially when we want to improve this explosive strength or these more specific strength capacities, you need to be looking at more things than just power, because power is not the determinant of performance. Power is just an external mechanical output that normally it's easy to test and to get, but just because it's easy to test, it doesn't mean it's important. And there are other things that are very important, such as, for example, the time that you have available to produce force, the angles in which you are producing force. So what Verkhoshansky called the region of accentuated force production. So there are plenty of factors that allow us to get more specificity in weight room, or to be more relevant in weight room, than just try to maximize like peak velocity or or peak power. And people normally are not looking at it. Also because the technology we have available or the softwares are not making it very easy. They don't provide those kind of metrics a lot of times. But again, just because it's easy to measure, it doesn't mean it's important. And I think that's the number one thing that normally S&C coaches have as a mistake.
I love this. So, besides like power, peak power, is there like certain metrics you're gonna look at, like like the one you just mentioned, like time to like peak time time for the peak force output, right?
Yeah, so I don't look, to be honest, to the power outputs. What I try to do is sport a needs analysis from the sport. So basically, I want to know how much time does the athlete have available to produce force in a sport, in his sport or in her sport. What kind of muscle actions are present in those sport movements. What kind of angles do they need to produce force? So if you are just training to get some structural adaptations, so for example, if you want to get muscle adaptations or tendon adaptations, I would not be so concerned about sport specificity. And this normally happens in general phases of preparation away from competition. But when you are getting close to competition, when you are trying to improve or maximize sport performance, you need to have those things in consideration. So I'll give an example. So let's say you work with two endurance athletes. One is a runner, another one is a cyclist. If you are training them in the exact same way in the weight room, especially when it comes close to competition, something is wrong. Because the time available to produce force for a cyclist is totally different from the time available to produce force for a runner. That's one thing. The other thing is that the angles of the lower limb where the runner needs to produce force are totally different from the cyclist. So the cyclist, the region or the angle where he needs to produce force is more in triple flexion when his foot is on the pedal. So when the foot is up, and the runner, where he produces more force, is with like 20 to 30 degrees of knee flexion and hip flexion. So totally different angles. So if you are training them in the same way, something is wrong because one uses a lot the stress shortening cycle, the other does not, is more contractile in nature. So the training will be totally different. So things that I look when I try to improve sport specificity is like the angles, the time to produce force, and in this case, for example, time to peak velocity can be a very good metric. So if you are moving faster, the bar or yourself, but the time to peak velocity is increasing, you are not being as specific, or you will not get so many relevant adaptations from it, even if your velocity is getting higher. And traditionally, we think this is good, but probably it will not get so good. It's the same thing as, for example, people normally test the counter movement jump. And they assume that just because you improve 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 centimeters in your vertical jump, that's a good adaptation. It may not be a very positive adaptation for a certain sport, because if before you were jumping 50 centimeters and it will take you 600 milliseconds, and now you are jumping 55 and it takes you 650 milliseconds, okay, you improved your output, but probably that will not transfer a lot for running or jumping, because in those scenarios you have short time to produce force, and you improve your counter movement jump in that case, probably because you improve the time to produce force. So totally different thing. So I would say the metrics that if I'm monitoring those metrics, I would say time to peak velocity, I would say the eccentric velocity of movements are very important to monitor much more than average velocities or peak velocities or peak power or average power outputs.
Love that. Love that. So you mentioned that different sports have like different angles. So even in the same sport like basketball, there's like different position like center or like the point guard. They have
Yeah,
different angle. So does that mean like even in the same sport with different position, you train it differently?
for sure. So you have in sports, especially team sports, you have different positions, different roles, different activities, different actions. So, on a general sense, everyone should be using, if we are talking about range of motion, everyone should be using large range of motion activities, exercises, especially in general preparation phases, especially if your goal is to improve mobility, especially if your goal is to improve muscle mass or increase muscle mass. We know, according to research, that larger range of motions are more appropriate for those kind of adaptations or goals. However, if your main goal with preparation is to improve specific sport performance in a certain action or sport or position, you need to have in consideration what are the demands of that position and their sport and their activity. So, but again, for example, if you go, let's go for a more simple example. If you go to the sprints or sprinter, 100-meter sprinter, like they have log start, they have acceleration phase, they have maximal speed phase, and they have like try to resist their speed to maintain their speed endurance. Of course, the angles you are at block clearance are different when you are running upright at maximal velocity. So just by the nature of this, you need to be training not only at shallow angles for maximal velocity, you need also to be improving their ability to produce force when they are in triple flexion, because that's a part of their event. So I think it all comes, Eric, to needs analysis. So you need to analyze your sport. In general, phases of preparation training will be more general, will not be so specific. But when you work especially with higher level athletes, that general phase will be short, just a couple of weeks to start the season. But afterwards, you need to think about like specific adaptations to the imposed demands, right? So you improve what you are training for. So if you want to improve maximal sprinting speed, you need to train the things that will make you sprint faster. So if we talk about the weight room, like you need to at least touch on some angles, on some time to produce force. You need to touch on fast eccentric, and fast transition from eccentric to concentric, and not only try to improve your squats or deadlifts or the power lifts. So that's the thing. I think it's important to analyze your sport to see what matters, measure what matters, and train what matters. So that's the thing about it.
So it's kind of like circle back to the topic we discussed last week, like not all strength created equals, right?
Yeah, for
That-
sure. So if you train just like what improved your performance when you had 1 or 2 or 3 years of training under the belt when you were young, or when you were a beginner athlete, it will not work when you are a professional or high level or elite athlete. It will not work. So you need to, for beginner athletes, yes, do the basic stuff. The basic stuff works for beginner athletes. If you improve maximal strength, general strength, they will improve everything across the board. But when it comes to the time of the point of diminishing returns, you need to get more specific. And to be more specific, you need to first know your event or sport. And after that, ask the questions. What do I need to do to improve these specific key performance indicators? And that will provide you the answer what you need to do in training to improve.
Love that. Love that. So that's kind of all the question I have for today. So if there's like coaches and therapists are interested in what we are talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, they can reach me, they can find me, especially on social media, especially on Instagram. If they search for my name, they will find more my profile. That's where I share more information. That's where I share some of my work. People can also find me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, although I don't use it much to share my own stuff. I use it more to see what other people are doing. So basically, that's it. People can find me there in social media just by searching for my name.
Appreciate it, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Eric, and hope to see you soon.